Don Jr. walked into the congressional hearing room with the air of someone expecting a familiar script to unfold, a stage where politics played louder than truth, and outcomes were as predictable as applause lines. But the moment Representative Jasmine Crockett carefully placed 3 distinctly colored folders on the polished table in front of her, something shifted. The next 45 minutes wouldn't be a routine political spectacle. They would expose the fragile scaffolding that had protected the youngest member of the Trump family from scrutiny for years. Silence rippled through the chamber as Jasmine arranged her papers with the calculated precision of someone who had lived in the high-stakes world of criminal defense. Her navy blazer lay smooth and unwrinkled against the rich wood of the long mahogany table, which gleamed under the uncompromising brightness of the overhead lights. In the far corner, the American flag stood erect, unmoving, its fabric frozen by the whisper of air from the well-calibrated ventilation system. The faint aroma of fresh coffee and lemon-scented furniture polish lingered from a side table, where aides nervously hovered, waiting for their cues. Everything about the House Oversight Committee hearing room was designed to overwhelm: the high ceilings, the ornate trims, the elevated dais where members loomed above their witnesses. Cameras were mounted in deliberate corners, small red lights blinking as silent indicators that every blink, sigh, and misstep would be transmitted to millions watching from afar. Reporters were crammed into the press area, backs rigid, fingers twitching above their keyboards. Staffers lined the walls. The public gallery, filled with those lucky enough to secure seats, leaned forward in unison like an audience waiting for a magician's trick. The microphones occasionally hummed with soft static, a mechanical reminder that even silence could pulse with tension. Don Jr. sat at the center of it all at the witness table, dressed for performance. One arm slung lazily over the back of his chair, his other hand toying with the knot of his crimson tie. His charcoal suit, crisp and expensive, was more than attire. It was armor. His posture was loose, bordering on theatrical. His expression, a blend of amusement and indifference, signaled he thought the entire event was a waste of his time. Lawyers flanked him, files stacked like fortresses between them. From time to time, they leaned in with whispered notes and reassurances. A glass of water sat untouched, sweating slowly onto a coaster. Across the table, Jasmine remained composed, a portrait of still focus. While others scrolled through their phones or whispered across the table, her gaze never left the man before her. She didn't come with theatrics. She came with a strategy. Her folders, blue, red, and yellow, weren't just props. They were weeks of evidence, testimony, and internal documents, color-coded, highlighted, and cross-referenced down to the last clause. A golden pin shaped like the scales of justice adorned her lapel, more than decoration, a declaration of who she was before Congress, a public defender who had fought uphill battles for those with no privilege. In her notebook, handwritten questions lay in orderly lines, each one supported by citations and contingency follow-ups. Her approach wasn't about volume, it was about precision. The committee chairman had just wrapped his grandstanding introduction, a performance stitched together more for media sound bites than procedural clarity. The hearing bore the title, Family Enterprise Ethics and Government Contracts, but no one in the room was confused. This was about the Trumps, about potential abuses of power and improper business ties. With the chair's voice fading, the ranking member began her statement. Jasmine's time would come in just over 10 minutes, while others took their turns. Posturing, Jasmine watched. She observed Don Jr. closely, clocking the subtle shifts. When Democrats spoke, he slouched, disinterested. When Republicans chimed in, he perked up, nodding. His right foot kept a steady, impatient rhythm beneath the table. Occasionally, his gaze drifted to the chamber door, perhaps imagining escape, or recalculating how far he'd have to walk to be free from this setting. Jasmine's journey to this moment wasn't born of legacy or political grooming. It had been earned in courtrooms back in St. Louis, where justice often favored those with money and shattered those without it. She had gone head-to-head with prosecutors who had more staff, more evidence, and more resources. What she brought instead was preparation, the relentless kind that unfolded in hours no one saw, in late nights combing through contradictory statements and hidden clauses. The night before this hearing, Jasmine was in her office well after midnight, poring over pages, highlighting irregularities and preparing for every dodge and deflection. She knew cases weren't won in dramatic standoffs, but in the quiet, thankless work leading up to them. Her years as a defender had taught her to move slowly, to be patient. Her style was never to shout someone down. It was to build the case, brick by brick, until there was nowhere left to hide. Witnesses often underestimated her calm. That was their first mistake. Now, in this hearing room, she had 5 minutes, just 5, to question Don Trump Jr., and she intended to use them. Like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, she and her staff had sifted through thousands of pages in the weeks leading up to this. They didn't hunt for headlines. They looked for inconsistencies, moments when public statements contradicted private documents. Their questions were laid out to trap no one, only to reveal what was already buried in the record. As the hearing wore on, Don Jr. handled earlier inquiries with breezy arrogance. To Republicans, he offered long-winded anecdotes about family values. To Democrats, he delivered sarcasm, dismissing questions as partisan attacks. He called one representative's inquiry a witch hunt, prompting snickers from his allies on the committee. Each response made him more comfortable. His shoulders relaxed, his tone grew smug. The room slid into a rhythm, partisanship dulling any sense of forward momentum, until the chairman cleared his throat and said the words that would change everything. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes. Jasmine adjusted her mic slowly, deliberately. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." Her voice, even and calm, cut through the air. No bluster, no venom, just poise. She turned her attention fully to Don Jr., who raised an eyebrow and offered her a practiced smirk. "Mr. Trump," she began, "I appreciate you being here today." He nodded with mock charm. "Glad to be here, Congresswoman." The room leaned forward, and the clock started ticking. Jasmine's tone didn't change as she moved into the heart of her questioning. It was steady, unbothered, deliberate, the tone of someone who knew she wasn't aiming for theatrics, but for truth wrapped in facts. "Mr. Trump," she said, flipping open the first of her blue folders, "I'd like to begin with the role family members play in your business operations, particularly as it relates to federal contracts awarded since 2022. She pulled out a single document, holding it between her fingers with the ease of someone accustomed to wielding paperwork like a blade. According to SEC filings, Trump Enterprises and its subsidiaries have received federal contracts totaling around $327 million in the last 3 years. To the best of your knowledge, is that number accurate?" Don Jr. leaned forward slightly. "Congresswoman, as I've said previously, our companies bid for contracts just like any others. We follow the rules. The number sounds close, but I'd need to double-check with our finance department to confirm the specifics." Jasmine nodded and jotted a quick note. Her face remained unreadable. "And those contracts," she continued, "were awarded through competitive bidding processes, correct?" Don Jr. gave a tight smile. "Absolutely. All by the book. We win contracts because we offer competitive pricing and high-quality services. Nothing more." "I see." She didn't challenge the statement, not yet. "Then could you list which family members are actively involved in decision-making roles within Trump Enterprises and its related companies?" Don Jr. raised his hands in a casual gesture of openness. "Well, there's myself, of course. Ivanka, my sister, serves in more of a strategic advisory role these days, not as hands-on. Eric oversees our real estate division. It's a family business, Congresswoman. Always has been." "And Barron Trump?" she asked, her voice level and direct. "Does he hold any official or unofficial role within the enterprise?" The name stopped Don Jr. mid-breath. His eyes blinked twice in quick succession, and his carefully controlled posture tensed, just for a second. "Barron? He's a teenager," he said, chuckling nervously. "Still in school. He has no official capacity, no decision-making role. So, to your knowledge, Barron Trump has not participated in any way in the preparation, strategy, or decisions tied to your company's federal contract bids? That's correct, Don Jr. replied quickly, though his voice had lost its previous ease. His lawyers exchanged glances but remained silent. Jasmine opened her second folder. Thank you. I'd like to direct your attention to an internal email dated March 17th of last year. It was sent from your company email to the Trump Enterprises executive team. She slid the document across the table, the paper gliding toward Don Jr. with slow finality. The email references a BT strategy for Defense Department contract bidding. Specifically, it states, and I quote, "BT's analysis of procurement trends gives us an edge here. Can you clarify what BT refers to in that context?" Don Jr. adjusted in his seat, his polished composure beginning to slip. "Congresswoman, I send hundreds of emails. It's hard to remember every abbreviation. BT could mean a number of things. Budget targets, business trends. I'd need more context. I can provide it," Jasmine responded without missing a beat. She passed a full printout of the email chain to the witness table. "Here's the entire communication." The room fell eerily quiet as Don Jr. reviewed the document. His lawyer leaned in, eyes narrowing as he read the highlighted portions. For a few moments, all that could be heard were soft camera clicks and the faint crinkle of paper. Don Jr.'s jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly around the edge of the document. Something in his breathing changed, and the confident rhythm had been replaced by something shallower, faster. "I remember this now," he said finally. His voice had a new edge. It was about a business technology initiative. That's what BT stands for. Business technology. A team in our company that analyzes trends. "Interesting," Jasmine said with subtle emphasis, "because within the same email chain, there's a reply from your CFO that reads, and I quote, 'Does BT have time for this level of involvement given his other commitments? Would you like to revisit your explanation?'" The correction landed like a dart. Don Jr.'s eyes narrowed. "As I said," he replied, his tone a touch defensive, "without full context, I can't speak definitively to every phrase. That reply could be misinterpreting the term, or referencing something else entirely." Jasmine calmly opened another document. "This," she said, holding up a sheet, "is your company's organizational chart from your last SEC filing. There's no department listed under business technology, but our review found 17 separate references to BT in your internal communications, all of them suggesting a person, not a department. Would you like to revise your answer again?" Now, the air in the chamber felt thick. Members of the committee leaned forward. Aides froze mid-scribble. Even the photographers had stopped shooting. Don Jr.'s smile had vanished. He glanced at his lawyer, who was furiously scribbling something on a legal pad. Don Jr. waved it off. "Congresswoman, you seem to be insinuating something. Why not just say what you're trying to say?" "There's no insinuation here," Jasmine replied coolly. "Just questions. Let's continue. Are you familiar with Presidential Directive 47B? "Yes," Don Jr. said with an irritated edge. "All our executives are briefed on applicable federal directives. This directive prohibits sharing classified procurement data with anyone lacking security clearance, including family members," Jasmine said as she opened her third folder. "Violations carry penalties up to $10 million and potentially criminal charges." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. "Have there been any cases where procurement information was shared with family members lacking clearance?" "Absolutely not," Don Jr. said firmly. He sat straighter now, clearly trying to reassert control. "That would be a serious violation, and we take compliance very seriously." "I appreciate that answer," Jasmine said, but she wasn't done. She flipped through her notes, then lifted a new document. "I have visitor logs here, Mr. Trump. Trump Tower entries over the last 18 months. According to these, Barron Trump visited the executive floor 17 times during time frames when your company was preparing bids for federal contracts. On at least 8 of those occasions, procurement strategies were discussed. Can you explain his presence?" The color drained slightly from Don Jr.'s face, even under the harsh lights. "He's my brother," he said quickly. "He's family. Sometimes he stops by. That doesn't mean he's involved. Jasmine didn't blink. So it's your testimony that Barron Trump was present, but didn't participate? He's interested in the family business, Don Jr. snapped. There's nothing wrong with that. Would you say that meetings involving classified procurement details are appropriate learning opportunities for an uncredentialed teenager? Jasmine asked, still calm. You're twisting this, Don Jr. said, his tone rising. No, Jasmine replied, now sliding another document forward. Your own procurement schedules indicate 8 of those meetings involved classified defense contracts. His lawyer leaned in. The silence returned. The game had changed. Don Jr. conferred briefly with his attorney, their murmured exchange barely audible over the now silent room. The usual ambient noise of shifting papers and whispered side conversations had completely vanished. All eyes were locked on the witness table. Even committee members who had previously checked out were now leaning forward, their expressions tense, expectant. Finally, Don Jr. straightened, hands folded in front of him. His voice, though measured, carried the clipped cadence of someone carefully choosing his words. Congresswoman, he began. Barron may have been present in the building, but he was not involved in any classified discussions. The visitor logs show he entered the executive floor. They don't detail who attended which meetings or what was discussed. Jasmine nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. That's an important distinction, she acknowledged. Thank you. But the pause that followed was not a retreat. It was tactical. She glanced down at her notes, then looked back up. Mr. Trump, are you familiar with Executive Order 13987? She asked. He exhaled sharply, trying to regain a tone of control. In general terms, yes, I'm aware. This order mandates that bidders on federal contracts disclose all family relationships of individuals involved in preparing the bids. It's a transparency safeguard. She opened her folder again, removing a form. Over the past 3 years, your company submitted multiple disclosure forms listing you, Eric Trump, and 14 other executives as contributors to contract bids. Barron Trump's name does not appear on any of them. Is that accurate? Yes, Don Jr. responded, irritation slipping into his voice. Because, as I've already said, he has no official role, he's not involved. Without reacting, Jasmine produced one final document from the third folder, this one heavier than the rest. Mr. Trump, she said, lifting the transcript in her hand, I have here a record from a meeting held in your office on April 3rd of this year. This meeting took place while your company was finalizing a bid for a $42 million defense contract. She adjusted her glasses and began to read aloud. According to the transcript, you stated, Barron's analysis of the competitive landscape gives us a significant edge here. Let's make sure we protect him in all this. He's just getting started, and we don't need him dragged into the political mess. She looked up and locked eyes with him. Mr. Trump, does this contradict your earlier claim that your brother plays no role in company operations? The shift in Don Jr.'s demeanor was instant. He stiffened, flushed, and leaned forward with force. Where did you get that? He demanded, his voice sharp. That was a private meeting, in my office. The transcript was submitted to this committee through proper legal channels, Jasmine replied, her tone still steady. The question remains. Does this statement contradict your testimony today? His lawyer reached out to his arm, attempting to rein him in, but Don Jr. pulled away. This is exactly the kind of political ambush my father warned about, he snapped. You people will twist anything. Now you're dragging a kid into your smear campaign? Jasmine didn't flinch. Barron Trump is 19 years old, she said quietly. And based on your own recorded words, he is providing analytical input on federal contract strategy. My question is simple. Did you knowingly omit his involvement from disclosure forms in violation of federal law? Don Jr.'s palm slammed the table, his water glass bouncing with the force. He's family, he barked. We were trying to shield him from exactly this nonsense. He's brilliant, okay? He understands numbers better than anyone his age. That doesn't mean, Mr. Trump, Jasmine interjected, not raising her voice but cutting through his tirade. Is it your sworn testimony that you deliberately withheld Barron Trump's involvement to protect him from scrutiny? You're twisting my words, he shot back, voice nearly shaking. He's a kid. He's learning. You're trying to vilify a teenager who's just watching his family operate. Jasmine stayed perfectly still. The contrast between her poise and his unraveling anger became more pronounced with every passing second. With all due respect, she said calmly, this hearing isn't about punishing anyone. It's about federal compliance. We're discussing the lawful reporting of individuals who influence bids worth hundreds of millions in taxpayer dollars. Don Jr. scoffed, loud and theatrical. This isn't about compliance, and you know it. This is about targeting my family again and again. She let the silence breathe, allowing the weight of his words to hang in the air. Then she pulled out one last piece of paper and slid it across the table. This is an email, sent from your address to your executive team, dated 3 weeks after the April meeting, she explained. It reads, and I quote, BT needs to be kept out of the official loop on these matters. His input is invaluable, but we need to protect him from the vultures who would use his involvement against the family. She paused and looked up again. Would you like to explain what you meant by keeping him out of the official loop? Don Jr. stared at the email in front of him. His lips tightened, his jaw clenched. His lawyer leaned in once more, whispering urgently. But Don Jr. seemed to have passed the point of counsel. You want to know what that meant? He said, voice dark and defiant. It meant we were trying to let a young man learn the ropes without being thrown into the fire. It meant we were shielding him from people like you. It meant we were protecting our own. Jasmine nodded slowly. So you admit he was involved in bid preparations but kept off official records? He's my brother, Don Jr. shouted, rising halfway from his chair. And we've been under attack since day one. You think we'd put him in the line of fire? No, we made a choice to keep things informal. That doesn't mean we broke any laws. The chairman's gavel cracked through the room like thunder. The witness will control himself. Jasmine waited for the gavel to fall silent. Then, with a breath as smooth as the ones she'd practiced for years in courtroom depositions, she posed the final question of her segment. Mr. Trump, let me summarize. Federal law requires disclosure of all individuals involved in preparing federal bids. Your own words show that Barron Trump contributed materially to those preparations. Yet his name was kept off official filings. Is that an accurate summary? Don Jr. sat back down, breathing heavily, rage and frustration coloring every inch of his face. You don't know what it's like to be us, he muttered. To have your family constantly under siege. He's gifted. He helps. We protect him. What would you have us do? Sacrifice him for your spectacle? Jasmine waited. And then, with a clarity that would echo far beyond that chamber, she said 5 words. Age doesn't justify complicity. Those 5 words, calmly spoken, surgically placed, struck the room like a thunderclap. Age doesn't justify complicity. It wasn't shouted, and it didn't need to be. It echoed not through volume, but through weight. Don Jr. froze. For a heartbeat, he stared at Jasmine, dumbfounded, his jaw slack. Then it came, an eruption that silenced even the low hum of the cameras. How dare you? He shouted, this time fully rising from his chair. His lawyer tried to restrain him with a desperate hand tug at his blazer, but he didn't budge. His finger jabbed the air as his face contorted into visible outrage. You sit there, with your smugness and your self-righteous lectures, and judge a family that's been under siege for years. You think you know what we've been through. You want to talk about complicity? Let's talk about the real complicity, the kind that infects this whole damn system. His voice climbed higher, rattling the chamber as he gestured violently toward Jasmine, toward the committee, toward the room. Let's talk about a political system that eats its enemies alive. About a media machine that prints lies without consequence. About Democrats pretending they care about rules when all they want is revenge. Bam! The chairman's gavel slammed down like a war drum. The witness will sit down and compose himself, he warned, voice hardening. But Don Jr. didn't sit. He pointed again, this time at Jasmine, his face a cocktail of fury and panic. You don't get to stand on that high horse and tell me about morality. Not when your entire party has spent years weaponizing every institution to destroy us. Mr. Trump, the chairman barked. This is your final warning. One more outburst and you will be held in contempt. The words registered just enough for Don Jr. to take a step back. His lawyer seized the moment, pulling hard at his sleeve. Finally, reluctantly, Don Jr. dropped back into his seat. His chest heaved, his fists clenched on the table. The performance was over, but the tension remained, thick as wet cloth. Reporters scribbled furiously. Flashbulbs stuttered like lightning. The image of Jasmine Crockett, still composed, still sitting upright, and Don Trump Jr., disheveled and furious, was already etched into the visual history of political theater. Jasmine, unaffected by the storm, waited in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, almost gentle. "Mr. Chairman," she said, "I have no further questions at this time." "The gentlewoman's time has expired," the chairman confirmed, though even his voice trembled slightly with the gravity of the exchange. "We'll recess for 15 minutes. The gavel came down again. The room, which had held its breath through Don Jr.'s tirade, suddenly exploded into motion. Journalists bolted for the doors, eager to get their leads filed. Aides whispered frantically to their members. Committee. Representatives leaned in toward one another in hushed tones. Don Jr. remained slouched in his chair, his lawyers forming a protective circle, urgently strategizing damage control. His expression hadn't softened, just hardened into something resentful and guarded. Jasmine calmly gathered her materials. Each folder closed, each document returned to its proper place with meticulous care. She made one final note in her notebook. A few colleagues moved to approach her, perhaps to offer congratulations or solidarity, but she held up a hand, gracefully, signaling she needed a moment. She poured herself a glass of water, took a sip, and let her gaze travel slowly across the hearing room, now a whirlwind of chaos she chose not to enter. Out in the hallway, a different kind of storm had begun to swirl. Clusters of news anchors stood with their cameramen, shooting stand-ups against the heavy oak-paneled backdrop. The clip of Jasmine's quiet statement, followed by Don Jr.'s explosion, was already making the rounds on social media. Phones buzzed with alerts, screens lit up with push notifications. On one major cable network, a reporter stood in front of a monitor displaying the moment frame by frame. A stunning confrontation on Capitol Hill, she reported breathlessly. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas calmly dismantling Donald Trump Jr.'s testimony about his younger brother's involvement in federal contract bids, ending with 5 words that are already going viral. She turned toward the screen. "Age doesn't justify complicity," a phrase now trending across social platforms and rapidly being shared alongside video clips of Don Jr.'s furious outburst. And the timing couldn't be more significant. Within an hour, the clip had amassed millions of views. Every corner of social media echoed with the same phrase. Some posted it as text. Others turned it into art. Activists, educators, and commentators from both sides of the aisle weighed in. And as with all viral moments, interpretation fractured along ideological lines. On one channel, a legal analyst praised Jasmine's cross-examination style. What she did was textbook, methodical, evidence-based, emotionless. It's called building the box. You assemble facts piece by piece until the witness walks himself into the truth. On another network, a Trump-leaning commentator slammed the committee. This was political theater, pure and simple. Thunderbury, Trumps have been targeted from the start, and now they're dragging a teenager into their agenda. Don Jr.'s reaction? That was a brother defending his family, nothing more. But despite the spin wars, something had broken through. The phrase itself had begun evolving into something more than a headline. It became a mirror. Age doesn't justify complicity. It was used by corporate watchdogs criticizing shady internships. Educators invoked it in classroom ethics discussions. Cartoonists reimagined it in courtroom sketches and protest banners. It was applied not just to Barron Trump, but to countless other systems where youth was used as a shield for power. It cut across politics, across professions, a quiet indictment of selective accountability. And inside a small waiting room near the chamber, Jasmine Crockett sat alone, checking none of her notifications. Her phone had been vibrating nonstop for the past 30 minutes, but she ignored it. She knew what was happening out there. She took a long breath, eyes closed for a moment. The storm she had calmly walked into had now become something much bigger. But she hadn't entered that hearing for attention. She had entered it for answers. This wasn't about making headlines. It was about the principle that had guided her entire career, from defending the voiceless in Texas courtrooms to facing down the most powerful political family in America. The idea was simple. The rules apply to everyone, no matter how old, no matter how rich, no matter the name. By the time the 15-minute recess ended, the committee room had transformed into something far more than a place for routine oversight. It had become a cultural stage. The walls, once just architectural flourishes of Capitol Hill design, now echoed with the remnants of 5 words that had already begun rewriting the national conversation. Jasmine re-entered the chamber with the same measured pace she had walked in with earlier that morning. No rush, no reaction to the storm she had ignited. She took her seat, her folders lined up neatly, her expression unchanged. She didn't need to watch the reactions on television screens or Twitter feeds to know the weight of what had occurred. She had felt the room shift before anyone else could name it. Down the hall, news anchors still scrambled to summarize what they had just witnessed. "Age doesn't justify complicity" was trending in every major city across the United States. Within 30 minutes, political commentators debated its meaning, but most understood one thing clearly. It was a statement that would outlast the hearing. Inside the room, committee members began to filter back in, some throwing glances toward Jasmine that held new respect, a few others masked concern behind political neutrality. Don Jr. was already seated again, his face pale but stiff, lawyers now whispering not just advice but strategy. Damage control had begun, but Jasmine wasn't thinking about trending hashtags. Her mind was focused on what would come next, not in the news cycle, but in policy. Because moments like these, while rare, had the power to do more than spark debates. They could change rules, close loopholes, redefine standards, but only if someone stayed focused when the cameras turned away. Across the country, living rooms and classrooms replayed the exchange. A government ethics professor in Pennsylvania paused her lecture midstream to show her students the viral video. "What you're watching here," she said, "is not just good questioning. It's a masterclass in quiet accountability." Cable panels were split-screening Jasmine's composed expression with Don Jr.'s explosive reaction. The dichotomy became symbolic, the calm of preparation versus the fury of privilege exposed. Even late-night comedians took note. "She didn't even flinch," one joked. "I've seen FBI agents in mob movies lose it quicker than Jasmine Crockett." Kept her cool. Meanwhile, Jasmine had work to do. Inside her office the next day, she reviewed the pile of messages her team had filtered. Letters from retired judges, emails from constituents, voice messages from young law students, women in politics, veterans, all moved by what they had seen, not just because a Trump had lost his cool, but because someone had finally confronted power without grandstanding or venom. Just facts, just clarity. And something about that struck people as new, even though Jasmine knew it wasn't. She had been doing this for years, just on smaller stages. The only thing that had changed was the size of the audience. As the day progressed, the impact deepened. Legal experts published articles analyzing possible federal contract disclosure violations. Procurement officers across government agencies quietly began rechecking records. The House Ethics Committee confirmed it was reviewing the transcript and email evidence introduced during the hearing. Within hours, watchdog organizations released statements calling for a formal investigation into Trump Enterprises' handling of federal bidding procedures. The Trump Organization responded by late afternoon. A spokesperson delivered the usual response. Barron Trump's involvement in company discussions was informal, educational, and entirely legal. No classified information was shared. This is another baseless attack on a family that has endured more scrutiny than any other in modern political history. But the tone of the statement didn't quiet the story. It only confirmed it had rattled them. Because this wasn't about whether Barron had legal right to be curious. It was about whether that curiosity had crossed lines laid down not by politics, but by law. Jasmine watched the coverage quietly from her office that evening, sipping lukewarm tea surrounded by files that still needed review. She knew how these cycles worked. The frenzy would last days, possibly weeks. Then it would die down, unless someone used the moment to push something real, and she planned to. That night, her staff worked late, drafting notes, outlining what a reform bill could look like. Because while many viewed what happened in that hearing room as a confrontation, Jasmine saw it as a door cracked open, one that could lead to policy that prevented not just this kind of oversight failure, but all the ones people never even hear about. She recalled the faces of clients she had defended years ago, people thrown into legal jeopardy for missing signatures, incorrect forms, poor representation. Meanwhile, billion-dollar companies navigated loopholes with entire legal departments. That imbalance was what had driven her to run for office in the first place, and now she had the moment. What she did next would matter far more than what had already aired. The following morning, during her scheduled press appearance, Jasmine stood at a podium outside the Capitol. Reporters filled the space, cameras blinking red, waiting for a soundbite. This hearing raised significant concerns, she began, her voice steady. Not just about individual accountability, but about the systems we've allowed to operate without proper oversight. Government contracts should be awarded based on merit, transparency, and compliance, not connection. That's not politics. That's good governance. The crowd stirred. Hands shot up. Questions came about Don Jr., about Barron, about the next steps. But Jasmine redirected each one toward policy. We will be proposing new legislation to strengthen disclosure requirements, she said, to clarify what constitutes participation in contract bidding, and to ensure that all companies, family-owned or not, operate within a clear and enforceable framework. As she stepped away, one reporter asked if she had prepared that 5-word line that sparked the firestorm. Jasmine smiled faintly. No, that wasn't written, that was just truth. And with that, she walked off, not toward another interview, but toward a working lunch with legislative aides. Because the cameras might love drama, but the law didn't change until someone picked up a pen and rewrote it. As the buzz around the hearing simmered into its second week, the viral moment began to take root in places far beyond Washington. What had begun as 5 minutes of questioning in a polished hearing room had now seeped into the marrow of public discourse. In coffee shops, boardrooms, college classrooms, and kitchen tables, people repeated the phrase like a mantra. Age doesn't justify complicity. It wasn't just a viral slogan anymore. It had become a cultural mirror. Editorial. Cartoons depicted wealthy heirs hiding behind shields labeled youth. Podcasts dissected the phrase for its ethical weight. T-shirts bearing the words sold out within hours on multiple websites. And inside the Capitol, something more tangible was shifting. A bipartisan group of legislators had taken note, not just of the spectacle, but of the substance. Within 6 months, a draft bill began to circulate behind the scenes. Its purpose, to strengthen transparency and disclosure rules for government contractors, especially those involving family-run businesses. The working title was Bureaucratic, Government Contracting Transparency Enhancement Act of 2025. But everyone on the Hill already had a different name for it, the Age Doesn't Justify Act. Jasmine reviewed the first draft from her seat on the House floor. She had insisted on specific language, mandatory disclosure of all individuals involved in any stage of contract preparation, regardless of title or relation. A clause addressing informal advisors had been added, a clear nod to the events that had sparked this movement. Watching from the gallery above were 20 law students from the University of Texas. Jasmine had personally arranged their passes after receiving a letter from their professor. "We've been studying your hearing," he wrote. "It's become part of our curriculum on evidence-based interrogation techniques. That moment with Mr. Trump taught my students more about courtroom discipline than I ever could with textbooks." As debate opened on the bill, lawmakers across party lines voiced support. Even those who had privately scoffed at the hearing felt obligated to acknowledge the principle at its core. Rules must apply consistently. The bill passed with a surprising majority. Jasmine allowed herself a brief smile, not for applause but for the reality that something lasting had been set in motion. After the vote, several members approached her quietly. One seasoned Republican, known for rarely crossing party lines, shook her hand. "You handled that hearing with surgical focus," he said. "Reminded me of when I was a prosecutor. Evidence still matters. That's rare these days." She didn't need praise, but that comment, quiet, sincere, and rooted in law rather than politics, meant something. Outside the limelight, investigations into Trump enterprises continued. The Securities and Exchange Commission imposed civil penalties for misrepresentation on disclosure forms. The Defense Department launched internal reforms, updating protocols for verifying who was involved in bids. There were no dramatic arrests or perp walks, just the slow, steady rhythm of institutional response, the kind that doesn't make headlines but makes a difference. Barron Trump eventually issued a carefully crafted statement through an attorney. In it, he acknowledged providing informal input to the company and announced that he would pursue his own career path, separate from Trump Enterprises. The statement emphasized his intent to respect legal boundaries and comply with transparency laws should he enter business or public life in the future. Whether this was genuine reflection or strategic repositioning, no one could say for sure. But the statement marked something rare in the Trump ecosystem: public acknowledgement of a line crossed. Jasmine didn't gloat, she didn't tweet. She returned to her schedule, committee meetings, constituent casework, legislative drafting. Because for her, the real work had never been about one moment. It had always been about what came after. She began receiving hundreds of letters from older women across the country, women in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They recognized something in her stillness, in her silence during Don Jr.'s outburst. They knew that type of power, the one that doesn't yell, doesn't react, doesn't beg for space. It just exists, firm and immovable. "I saw myself in you," wrote a 63-year-old retired teacher from New Hampshire. "The number of times I stayed calm while someone tried to shout me down, too many to count. But that calm is power, and you wielded it like a blade." One letter simply read, "Thank you. You made us feel seen." The phrase "age doesn't justify complicity" had become a rallying cry, yes, but also a quiet validation for people who had spent decades upholding principles in places where principles often lost. Jasmine was later invited to speak at a national conference on government ethics. It was a room full of compliance officers, federal watchdogs, legal experts, the kind of audience that didn't clap easily. But as she took the stage, a wave of stillness fell over the room. She didn't mention Donald Trump Jr. or Barron Trump by name. She didn't need to. "This isn't about going after individuals or families," she said. "It's about protecting the integrity of our systems. Systems only work when the rules apply the same way to everyone, not just in theory, in practice." She paused. Inexperience doesn't justify special treatment. Family loyalty doesn't excuse deception, and power does not entitle anyone to exemption from the rules that bind us all. A long silence followed, not of confusion, but of absorption. Then the applause came, not thunderous, not performative, but sincere, measured, professional, the kind that came from people who understood exactly what she was trying to protect. That evening, over a modest dinner with colleagues from both parties, the topic of trust in institutions came up. An older senator leaned across the table. "You know why your moment stuck?" he asked Jasmine. "Because you didn't look like someone trying to win. You looked like someone who still believed in the system." She nodded. "I do believe," she replied. "Not blindly, but deeply. Because if we let cynicism win, we lose everything." As she stepped out into the cool night air, her phone buzzed with a news alert. The Justice Department had reached a settlement with Trump Enterprises. Substantial fines, mandatory oversight, new disclosure policies. No headlines screamed justice. No ticker tape parades, just a quiet procedural correction, the way the system was meant to work. And for Jasmine, that was enough. The months that followed the Justice Department's announcement didn't carry the weight of spectacle, but rather the deeper weight of progress. Slow, procedural, and invisible to those not looking closely. There were no viral moments, no trending soundbites. But across Washington's agencies, forms changed. Checklists grew longer, disclosures became stricter, and most importantly, oversight began to shift from reactive to preventative. Back in Texas, inside a modest office tucked behind a row of local businesses, Representative Jasmine Crockett returned to the daily grind of her congressional responsibilities: constituent services, policy research, educational outreach, the kind of work that didn't make headlines, but made a difference. 3 weeks after the settlement, Jasmine sat across from a group of local community college students who had scheduled time to discuss cuts to federal education funding. They were nervous, unsure of how to speak to a congresswoman, but she greeted them with an easy smile and an open notebook. "Thank you for being here," she said sincerely. "Your concerns are exactly why this work matters." They talked about textbooks, tuition, and jobs. Jasmine listened intently, asking questions, taking notes. Not once did she mention Washington or hearings or viral phrases. Because here, in this room, those moments weren't currency. What mattered was trust. That someone who had stood firm in the spotlight could also show up when there was no spotlight at all. Later that afternoon, as she packed for her return to D.C., an aide slipped her a folder. Inside was a memo. The House Ethics Committee had announced it would expand its hearings into government contracting practices, citing her original line of questioning as the catalyst. She closed the folder and smiled, not out of pride, but from the quiet satisfaction that comes when preparation meets patience. This was the part of the job that mattered most, the part where policy evolved because someone had asked the right question at the right time. Months turned into a year. The viral clip had long since faded from the daily churn of the news cycle, but the impact remained. Editorial boards continued to cite the principle in their commentary. Advocacy groups used the hearing transcript as a training tool for younger activists. And in classrooms across the country, the phrase had been adopted as shorthand for accountability. Age doesn't justify complicity. 5 words that had outlived the moment and become something more. A bipartisan coalition in Congress introduced follow-up legislation, this time aimed at broadening the definition of informal advisors in corporate disclosures. The preamble of the bill directly referenced the loophole exposed during Jasmine's questioning of Don Jr. The press release made no mention of Trump, but everyone understood its origin. Jasmine didn't attend the press conference. She was meeting with staffers from the Department of Defense, reviewing the new bidding protocols for small vendors, because the goal had never been credit. The goal had been correction. Back in the Trump orbit, efforts to reframe the narrative continued. Interviews were given. Social media posts emphasized mentorship and family business traditions. A morning show host echoed the refrain. Every family business in America teaches the next generation how it works. This is no different. But for many, that defense no longer held. Because the issue had never been about teaching. It had been about transparency, about whether the rules that govern public resources apply with equal weight to the privileged and the powerless, about whether a last name could bend scrutiny, or if, finally, the system could withstand that pressure. At a panel on women in law and governance, Jasmine was asked how it felt to become a symbol. She smiled faintly, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think symbols help people the way systems do," she said. "Moments come and go. But if those moments don't push the system to evolve, they disappear. My job is to make sure the system doesn't forget what it learned." The room erupted into applause, but again Jasmine didn't flinch. She nodded once, respectfully, then moved on to the next question. Weeks later, while attending a policy summit, she found herself seated beside a federal compliance officer who had spent years buried in procurement paperwork. "I just want to say thank you," he said quietly, almost embarrassed. We've been flagging gaps like that for years, but no one really noticed until that hearing. She turned to him, not as a politician, but as someone who understood the frustration of being ignored for too long. I noticed, she said. The true ripple effects of her words continued, not in headlines, but in the way meetings changed, in the way emails were worded, in the way young interns, fresh in their first week on Capitol Hill, referenced the phrase during internal briefings. Back in Texas, Jasmine visited a high school civics class. The teacher had played the hearing clip during their lesson on congressional oversight. One student, a 17-year-old girl with box braids and a notebook filled with annotations, raised her hand. "How did you stay calm?" she asked. "When he got loud and angry like that, I would have cracked." Jasmine gave a soft laugh. "I've faced bigger storms than that," she said. "When you're grounded in truth, and when you've done your homework, you don't have to react. You just let the facts speak. That's what I did. I let the evidence do the talking." Another student asked if her background as a public defender helped prepare her for that moment. She nodded. "Absolutely. Being a public defender teaches you to see through noise, to rely on records, not volume, and most importantly, to know that justice doesn't always show up with a bang. Sometimes it whispers. But you have to be listening." As she walked out of the school that day, one of the students handed her a folded note. "Thank you," it read, "for proving we can speak truth and still be heard." She tucked it into her bag beside her briefing notes for the next committee session, because the hearing was over. The moment had passed, but the principle, that was just getting started. A full year after the hearing that sent shockwaves through the country, the long arc of accountability finally reached a new milestone. On the House floor, the Government Contracting Transparency Enhancement Act of 2025 passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Its nickname remained firmly attached, the Age Doesn't Justify Act. It was no longer just a phrase, it was law. The bill required detailed disclosures of all contributors to federal bids, whether formal or informal. It closed the loophole that had once allowed quiet family advisors to influence the direction of hundreds of millions of dollars in government contracts without ever being named. From the visitors' gallery, Jasmine Crockett watched the vote unfold. She didn't take the podium. She didn't give a final speech. She simply observed, not as the face of a movement, but as its catalyst. The cameras weren't on her, and she preferred it that way. The real work had already been done. Across the aisle, representatives who had once dismissed her concerns now spoke openly about the importance of transparency and fairness in government procurement. Even those who hadn't supported the bill's initial drafting acknowledged that the law addressed a fundamental weakness in the system. After the vote, a reporter caught Jasmine in the hallway. "Congresswoman Crockett, how does it feel to see that your 5 minutes of questioning led to legislation that might change how government contracts are handled?" She paused before answering, her face thoughtful. "It's not about my 5 minutes," she said. "It's about the thousands of hours that came after, reviewing policies, debating language, building consensus. One moment raised the flag, but this vote, this is what accountability looks like." Her words didn't trend. There were no viral clips this time. But in agencies across the country, contracting officers received updated guidelines. Auditors received clearer mandates. The process, slow and quiet, moved forward. Meanwhile, Don Jr. remained largely silent. His earlier outbursts now faded into the distant churn of political memory. His family's legal team issued a short statement. "We welcome transparency, measures that apply to all companies equally. Our commitment to ethical business practices remains unchanged." There were no follow-up interviews, no primetime rebuttals. Barron Trump's role in the events that sparked the investigation remained a gray area in the public imagination. Some believed he had been a passive observer, others suspected more involvement. But one thing was clear. The new law ensured that gray areas would no longer go unexamined. For Jasmine, the spotlight had long since dimmed, and that was how she liked it. She returned to her committees, drafted housing initiatives, met with veterans groups, reviewed environmental policy. The hearing hadn't elevated her above the work. It had cemented why she had chosen it in the first place. One afternoon, she sat in a round table with first-year congressional interns, mostly young women, many of them women of color. The topic of the hearing came up as it always did. "Did you know you were making history in that moment?" one of them asked. Jasmine smiled. "No," she said. "I just knew I was holding someone accountable to the truth. That's not history. That's the job." They asked what kept her calm, what gave her strength, how she didn't snap when provoked. "I didn't need to win an argument," she explained. "I just needed the truth to land harder than the shouting." They scribbled in notebooks, not because they wanted to imitate her performance, but because they wanted to understand her restraint. That was the real lesson. Poise isn't weakness. It's power with discipline. That night, Jasmine returned to her office to find a handwritten letter sitting on her desk. It was from a former federal procurement officer who had recently retired. The letter read, "I spent 30 years trying to warn people that backdoors and family ties were creating invisible influence in the contract process. You changed that, you made it visible, and then you made it actionable. Thank you, Folded the letter carefully and placed it beside another note, the one from the high school student, who had thanked her for proving that truth could be powerful without being loud. The two notes sat beside each other, framed. A reminder that moments matter, but legacy is built in what follows. A month later, Jasmine returned to that same high school. The civics class she had visited had invited her to see their final presentations. Each student had chosen a case study of congressional oversight, and one group had chosen hers. They presented a timeline of events, the hearing, the fallout, the legislation, the impact. At the end, one of the students turned to her and asked, "Do you think you'll ever have another moment like that again?" Jasmine considered it, then replied, "I hope not." The class laughed, unsure what she meant, until she clarified, "I hope the systems work so well next time that there isn't a need for viral moments. I hope everything we did after that hearing makes the next one unnecessary. That's what real change looks like, when the moment doesn't need to repeat itself." They nodded. And maybe they understood, maybe not yet fully. But one day they would. As the school day ended and Jasmine walked back to her car, she paused for a moment to take in the ordinary scene. Students running across the lawn, teachers gathering materials, buses idling in the lot. It was peaceful. Normal. A world not disrupted by injustice but protected by quiet, sturdy systems that people rarely noticed when they were working right. And that, Jasmine thought, is the goal, not glory, not fame, but function. Back in D.C., she returned to her office, pulled out her legal pad, and began outlining her next policy focus. There was more to do. Always more. But this time, it would be done with the confidence that the system could respond, could evolve. The legacy of that hearing was not in the confrontation, it was in the correction. The 5 words, "Age doesn't justify complicity," no longer needed to be spoken. They had already become law.